The romantic town of Traben-Trarbach lies nestled between the hilly woods and vineyards of the Mosel River Valley. Splendid hiking and biking paths tie together numerous idyllic wine towns and villages. The mystical atmosphere of this unique river landscape is framed by old castle ruins, marvelous wineries, and noble mansions. Even Bruno Möhring, a famous Art Nouveau architect from Berlin, was inspired by this town's special location and ambience. One of Möhring's buildings is a castle-like structure built in 1906 in Traben-Trarbach for the Julius Kaiser winery. This historical building was renovated extensively in 2008 and 2009. It now houses the largest and most extensive museum for Buddhism in Europe. With more than 2,000 antique and contemporary art treasures from all over Asia, the Buddha Museum offers a remarkably profound insight into the world of Buddhist statues and the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama. The different styles and gestures of the Buddha figures, some of which are up to 2,000 years old, as well as Buddha's rational doctrine and the epic history surrounding him, are comprehensively presented. No one can withdraw the fascination and charisma of this extraordinary collection. Each and every visitor of this exceptional museum is taken into the Buddhist world of wisdom, awareness, tolerance, and meditation.
Welcome to the exhibition Moments with Buddha. Moments with Buddha presents a temple-like atmosphere with over 100 antique Buddha statues from different Asian countries, explains the iconography of the Buddhas and the Buddhist philosophy in its basic features. According to Hindu philosophy, started everything with a Om. Om is a syllable from the ancient Indian language Sanskrit. The sound of Om represents the transcendent Big Bang, whose vibration is Hindu understanding of the entire universe emerged. The Om is among Hindus, Jainas and Buddhists as a sacred, and it encompasses the realm of the visible phenomena as well as the realm of transcendence, and thus became the object of mystical meditation. It corresponds with the conditions of watching, of dreaming, of the deep and the lowest resting. For the realization of these states, it is certainly worth thinking deeply that 2,500 years ago, resulting Buddhist teaching, the origins of the universe and its material composition requires matter, antimatter, Big Bang, spheres, atoms, energy had long been the basis of their philosophy, subjects on which in the meantime today's physics believe. While the Western-oriented people in the world of visible appearances live, Buddhism offers its students, through the trail of the transcendental meditation world, to bring soul and body in harmony together and to get to know how the soul is feeling in order to find the real meaning of life, inner peace and true happiness. In 560 before Christ, Siddhartha Gautama was born as the son of a nobleman of the Shakya nation in northern India, at the foot of the Himalaya. He enjoyed great wealth and received his education from the wisest scholars of his day. Siddhartha was born into a world governed and imbued by the Hindu religion, which believes in the endless cycle of rebirth and reincarnation. But confronted with the reality of life, with suffering and death, he was beset by doubts. He was able to recognize no sense nor meaning in the cycle of birth, suffering, sickness, age and death, followed always only by rebirth to the same sad fate. And so, at the age of 29, he left the palace of his father in order to experience the true meaning of life and to find a way out of this ever-repeated suffering. For 6 years, Siddhartha wandered through the valley of the Ganges as a mendicant ascetic searching for deliverance. He applied many different methods in this search. When he found that even the strictest ascetic practices were bringing him no closer to his goal, he decided to follow his own path, that of meditation. And so, at the age of 35, he finally achieved, through immersion in his own self and spirit, perfect enlightenment. This enlightenment rests on a rule for life and conduct, consisting in ethics, morality, wisdom and concentration of the spirit, which Siddhartha had come to know by acquiring knowledge of his own thought processes in deepest meditation. In this way, he became one who has awoken, a Buddha. The Buddha's doctrine has its basis in the Four Noble Truths. The first of these truths is, life in all forms in which it appears is suffering. Secondly, the cause of all suffering lies in the fundamental evils of craving, hatred and ignorance. Thirdly, to overcome these basic causes of suffering means to triumph over suffering itself. Fourthly, this triumph is attained by following the middle way, also called the Noble Eightfold Path. This consists in right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. The Buddha delivered his first sermon in Benares, before an audience consisting of his former companions, the 5 ascetics. From then on, he began to found Buddhist communities. He continued to teach and preach for another 45 years. He died at the age of 80 in Kusinara. Do not consider me. Consider rather the state of enlightenment I have achieved. The Buddha did not want his own person depicted. For this reason, it was only some 500 years after his death, in the 1st century Anno Domini, in the schools of Gandhara and Mathura, that the first images and effigies of the Buddha were made. This Buddha effigy made in the 3rd century Anno Domini from the blue-grey slate favoured by the school of Gandhara, shows the Greco-Hellenic influence that was typical of these early images. A face recalling that of a Greek Apollo, the robe worn like a toga. Such was the appearance of the earliest Buddha effigies. It was doubtless due to the lingering influence of the culture left behind by Alexander the Great, whose campaigns of conquest had taken him in 326 before Christ from his native Greece through Persia, even as far as India, that the earliest Buddhist effigies were produced in a Greco-Hellenic style. So as to preserve it from the ravages of time and space, its creator applied certain enduring iconographic rules and principles to the posture, the body form and the dress of the figure we see in this effigy. 32 of the main points of these rules concern qualities which, according to Buddhist philosophy, make it possible to tell right from the moment of the birth of a sublime human being whether the person in question is destined to become a ruler of the world or a Buddha. 80 additional iconographic details, such as the established mudras or symbolic hand positions, or the equally strictly codified sitting positions, the asanas, make effigies like this complete. A striking feature of all Buddhist effigies, for example, is their long earlobes. This is explained by the story of how Siddhartha, when he left his father's palace at the age of 29, took off all the princely jewelry he had hitherto worn. His earlobes remained stretched by the heavy golden earrings he had worn so long, and it is in memory of Siddhartha Gautama, the first teacher of Buddhist doctrine, that all Buddha effigies have long earlobes. Another constantly present detail is the top-knotted hair. In later images, this tuft of hair became an actual physical protuberance of the skull, a sign of the Buddha's special enlightenment. The absence of this protuberance in an image identifies it as one of a monk or bodhisattva. We see several of these 32 key characteristics exemplified in this bronze Buddha from the 15th century. He should have a chin like a mango stone, his hair jet black, delicately curled and drawn over to the right, the arms reaching down to the knees, legs like those of an antelope, heels that promise great leaps, feet that leave perfectly regular marks as they go. The front of his body should resemble a lion, and between his shoulders there should be no furrow. These rules have been faithfully observed for 2,000 years, right up to the present day. They were passed on by monks from monastery to monastery, across the borders of India and beyond. They are faithful too, indeed, to Siddhartha Gautama's wish that no image should be made of his own individual person. Since, for almost 500 years, there was indeed no image made of him, all possibility of knowing how he actually personally looked was lost. What the effigies, when they emerge, portray is rather the philosophy of Buddhism. This philosophy is rooted in renunciation, a virtue represented here by the simplicity of the robe. Tolerance in matters of doctrine, no dogmas, freedom of thought and belief, the absence of binding obligations toward old traditions and conventions. Wisdom and meditation form the basis of the path to true knowledge. The Buddha's meditative immersion in his own self should be reflected, in these images, in his face, and to look on them should remind us to find our strength always in our own inner being. 300-year-old Buddha. With its typical hanging robe in Chinese style and the open U form in the chest area, this image too displays all the major iconographic features of the tradition. The middle fingers of the left hand are bent in a gesture meant to ward off Mara, the personification of evil. This image is known worldwide as the Lucky Buddha. But the lack of any protuberance on his head tells us that the figure in fact represents only a monk. The legend on which the image is based, that of a penniless but good-humored mendicant monk stems from 10th century China. In China, the figure represented here is called Budai, or Mi Lo Fo. In Japan, he is revered as Hotai. He stands for happiness, prosperity, and contentment. It is said that to rub the belly of a Budai 3 times brings good luck. Kakanya, a monk, a great scholar, he was the inventor of the Thai alphabet. He was slim, handsome, and intelligent, qualities which made him an object of extreme interest for the opposite sex. Since a monk is instructed never even to look directly at a woman and to preserve all his strength for meditation, Kakanya set about increasing his daily consumption of food until his body was of such a girth that the former lascivious glances no longer came to distract him. Here, we see him in a position perfectly adapted to the meditation he valued above all else, even if he can no longer quite join his hands together over his enormous belly. Even in images of famous monks, as in this beautifully worked 18th century Kakanya from Ayutthaya, once the seat of one of Thailand's royal dynasties, the iconography of Buddhist statuary is precisely observed, right up to the tuberance of the skull and the 3 symbolic wrinkles in the neck. Although the latter detail is largely submerged here in Kakanya's piously accumulated rolls of fat. Buddha adorned with jewels, the Buddha exhorting the earth to stand witness to his Buddhahood. Rings on his fingers, chains, diadems, golden armbands, a crown on his head. Since material possessions do not accord with Buddhist philosophy, this image can only refer to that legend of the Brahmin king Jambupati's refusal to listen to the Buddha's doctrine. The Buddha invited Jambupati to visit him. The notoriously arrogant king arrived, and the Buddha once again put on all his old princely regalia so as to meet him on an equal footing. The Buddha, indeed, was not content just with showing himself to Jambupati in his royal finery. He also caused fire to shoot up out of the earth all around him. Jambupati was so impressed by all this that he consented to hear his teachings and eventually became a disciple. People in Asia are particularly proud of this legend that even a king became a disciple of the Buddha, and the image of the latter in princely regalia exists in many versions, as in this 16th century figure from Lanna in northern Thailand. The legend of the walking Buddha originates from the Thai kingdom of Sukhothai, which flourished in the 13th and 14th century. The legend relates how Siddhartha, after his enlightenment, visited his mother Maya in heaven in order to tell her too of his teachings. These effigies show him striding back down out of heaven onto the earth. The mudra formed by his hand, the fingers pointing upward, the palm turned towards the viewer, is one that signifies the granting of protection or fearlessness. This effigy from the 14th century is made from polished green stratified stone and represents the transition period from the Khmer to the Thai style of Buddhist sculpture. It was only some 70 years ago that some old Chinese texts revealed the existence of a Dvaravati culture of Buddhist art in the 6th and 8th century. The broad face, strong nose and fleshy lips suggest local influence. Also typical for this period is the leg-hugging robe. We see in this effigy the mysterious smile, typical of Burmese Shan period sculpture of the 17th century. Seated, his hands held in a mudra signifying the exaltation to the earth, Siddhartha attains Buddhahood. The same smile distinguishes this papier-mâché head created in the later Shan period, 18th century. Ayutthaya was the greatest of the various Thai kingdoms. 5 dynasties and 33 kings reigned in Ayutthaya over a period of 417 years. In 1767, Ayutthaya was attacked by the Burmese and burned to the ground. Perhaps the new and special seriousness of the face in this effigy from just this latter period is a reflection of these terrible events. Chinese Ming Dynasty bronze, 15th century. On the breast we see the swastika symbol, in Oriental art a symbol of good luck, or of the wheel of the sun, with a tradition stretching back 6,000 years. These next Buddhas originate from the Cambodian kingdom of Angkor. They were made in the 12th and 13th centuries. Covered in a beautiful green patina, show the Buddhas meditatively removed from this world, distant in his sublime perfection. This patina, which in fact produces different visual effects, takes centuries to form and tends to be present above all in bronzes which have been buried or exposed to humidity. Head of a Xiang Sen Buddha from the 15th century. The head had originally featured a flame above the skull protuberance, a further sign of transcendence, but this has been lost with the passage of time. a Buddha in meditation from the 12th century. He is seated on the thrice-folded body of the Naga, or serpent queen Muchalinda. The legend tells of how the Buddha sat exposed to the elements in meditation for 42 days after his enlightenment. There came a terrible rainstorm, and the serpent queen protected him by spreading above him the broad hoods of her 7 heads. Muchalinda had originally been revered by the Khmer as a water spirit, and in this way gained entry into Buddhist iconography. Above we see the principal head of Muchalinda. Eyes, nose and jaws are plainly visible. To the left and right are 3 further heads. The image is lovingly worked and fashioned right down to the individual scales of her skin. All the Angkor effigies, whether worked in bronze or in stone, show the enormous skill of the Khmer artisans. This Angkor Buddha from the 12th century is again in princely regalia. Again, the hands display the mudra of teaching or scholarly disputation. His simple robe is finely decorated by his jewelry and by his belt bearing lotus blossom designs. We also see here the urna, known in the West as the third eye, a wall of hair from which there emanate the rays of enlightenment that illuminate the world. This 19th century Japanese Amida Buddha displays the same hand gesture of the scholar or teacher. He is standing on a stepped pedestal surmounted by a lotus blossom. Yet another sign of the Buddha's transcendence is the flame resting on the traditional skull protuberance. It is the last identifying characteristics of a sublime Buddha. Sculpted in alabaster in the 18th century, this Burmese Buddha also features princely regalia. The high crown and heavy earrings identified as a creation of the Shan period. Such white alabaster figures tended to be painted so as to better bring out their contours. Another Buddha in meditation, a masterpiece from the 12th century. Seated in princely regalia, this Buddha symbolizes the typical sculptural style of Angkor. He wears a cone-shaped crown and is also adorned with heavy earrings, necklace, and arm and leg bands. His robe is hung over both shoulders. At one time, effigies of a crowned Buddha were decorated with real jewelry in order to beautify with still greater endowment the object of veneration. This Buddha image of the early Ayutthaya period shows the Buddha in a deep meditation aimed at achieving total concentration and pacification of the spirit, one of the central pillars of Buddhist doctrine. The Buddha teaches us that the meditating individual should concentrate on his own breathing, or should choose with special attention some other fixed goal for his concentration. Sustained intense meditation leads, in this way, to a state of consciousness in which there is no longer any distinction between subject and object. The I-self of the deeply meditating individual is dissolved so that he becomes one with the Absolute. In this way, he or she hopes to experience awakening, or, in other words, enlightenment. Today, meditation is also used more and more as an instrument of self-healing, applied both to mind and body. Buddhist doctrine does not teach belief in a God who created the world. It teaches rather that the soul of each human being is a part of a transpersonal, universal soul. If one lives one's life according to the Four Noble Truths, then the egoism of the individual soul becomes less and less. This brings it about that, with each reincarnation, one is reborn into higher and higher strata of being. By behaving rightly in this way, the soul becomes less and less fixated on its illusory I-self. Karma, a kind of storage mechanism for what we do when we are alive, thus sees to it that the I-self slowly vanishes, and that the soul, in the sense of a narrow personal soul, is slowly dissolved. This is the final deliverance from the cycle of eternal rebirth. Nirvana, the highest aim of the Buddhist effort to achieve salvation, is thereby attained. Nirvana consists in the snuffing out of the narrow personal soul, or, to use another image, its blowing away, in the infinitude, the universal energy of the all-embracing transpersonal world soul. After his death, that the Buddha's teachings and sayings were given fixed written form by various Buddhist councils. At a long series of further councils, some of whose results were highly controversial, Buddhism underwent many changes, particularly in the period around the 1st century Anno Domini. Theravada Buddhism is the doctrine as originally taught by the Buddha. In the course of time, this doctrine appeared to many monks to be too abstract. Thus there developed over the centuries new schools and tendencies intended to make the truths of Buddhism more accessible to ordinary people. The two largest schools are to be found today in Theravada Buddhism, which is called the Old Way. It teaches a philosophy of self-deliverance through self-redemption. Mahayana Buddhism is called the Greater Vehicle, and offers to those seeking enlightenment rather a philosophy of altruism and selfless action in place of egoism. Mahayana Buddhism is characterized by the greater occurrence and importance of the figure of the Bodhisattva, an enlightened being who forms a link between the transcendent Buddha and ordinary human beings. These Bodhisattvas are distinguished by an especial love and sympathy for all living beings. They choose to forego their own entry into the state of nirvana, so as to be able to stay in the world and help others to achieve the karma that will lead them towards salvation. This Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara was created during the Chinese Ming dynasty and is the very embodiment of sympathy and ministering grace. The Buddha was no god. He was a human being. His doctrine arose out of the nature of the human mind and spirit. Effigies of the Buddha are, for this reason, not worshipped. They are merely revered and honored to the highest degree. It has been usual for a statue or effigy of the Buddha, which has been made for traditional purposes, to undergo, on being set in its place, certain prescribed rites of consecration. It was traditional that, when a new Buddha was crafted, it was set up in the temple in front of the main Buddha image, where a chapter of 30 monks sang its ritual of consecration. The high point of such ceremonies was when the presiding monk evoked the spirit of the Buddha himself, that the transcendent power of the enlightened one might pass over onto this new image and effigy. In this way, the sculpture or effigy was consecrated. it gained an identity of its own and was from then on treated as if it were a living being. This remains the case today. Food is left for such statues. On Buddhist New Year, the statue is washed like a human being. The place in front of the statue is a place for meditation. One can tell one's troubles to it and hope for protection and good fortune through the Buddha. Magical powers are also imputed to such effigies, which is why they are sometimes worn as amulets around the neck. The Buddha is drawn into the midst of daily life. This large bronze statue of the Buddha from the Rattanakosin period in Thailand, 19th century, once decorated a temple. Siddhartha is shown here in a state of sublime meditation. Still, his hand is portrayed in a mudra, symbolizing the exaltation of the earth. With his right-hand fingers, he is touching the earth's surface, exhorting the whole planet to stand witness to his Buddhahood. The legend tells of how Mara, the personification of evil, tried to disrupt Siddhartha's state of enlightenment by presenting him with various illusions, but could not succeed in this. Mara asks the earth goddess Tarini why he cannot defeat Siddhartha, and she replies, because Siddhartha has acquired for his karma so many virtues and merits that evil has no chance against him. The legend goes on to tell of how Tarini then wrung out her wet hair and how the flood of water tumbling from it swept away Mara and his whole assembled army of evil. It was in this moment that Siddhartha became an awakened one, a Buddha. The Buddha's asana, or leg posture, is that of a hero, because he has withstood and conquered Mara, the evil one. The Buddha's teachings know no dogma. There is nothing that must imperatively be believed. The goal is simply the full development of all the possibilities that lie inside each individual. Attentiveness, wisdom, and meditation offer a realistic basis which can lead to a true knowledge gained in one's own right. The Buddha exhorts and invites interested people to draw into the path mapped out by his doctrine of the Four Noble Truths and of meditation, experiences of their own, and the philosophy they have derived from these experiences. Particularly considered as art, statues and effigies of the Buddha are not objects of worship or adoration. They are mirrors of our own inmost being. They are icons symbolizing a journey out of ignorance and towards enlightenment. They draw the mind and spirit away from the world of conventional appearances and illusions towards heavenly regions which would otherwise be forever inaccessible to ordinary human knowledge.